Alright guys, I'm making this video as a follow-up with our last one. If you did not have a chance, in that video I went through and I talked about some specific beginning draft strategy for fantasy baseball leagues. I know a lot of people are just now getting into fantasy baseball, including myself, where I've been a massive fan of Major League Baseball for a very long time. Y'all know all I do every single second of the day is eat, drink, breathe fantasy sports. So, of course, we are jumping in headfirst to fantasy baseball. I've brought on some very smart people on the podcast already to talk to y'all, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. On this channel, you're going to see very few videos from myself that are just solo, because whenever we get down to the very small details, the very advanced strategy, while I can come out here and talk about it, I'm not necessarily going to be able to help you with it. A lot of the things I say will be wrong, whereas the beginning strategy, I have this on lock. I've talked to so many smart people by now that we can go through and we can give some very basic fantasy baseball advice for anybody who has maybe only played in a fantasy baseball league a year or two. Maybe they're completely new to fantasy baseball. So yeah, as always, my number one piece of advice if you are new to fantasy baseball is going to be to hit that subscribe button. Go down there, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell next to the subscribe button, because we are going to be bringing you a new fantasy baseball video every single day. The majority of the videos are going to feature someone a lot smarter than myself talking to y'all. But regardless, you will have one hitting your subscription feed to try to help you improve your fantasy baseball game. And because we're going to be doing a video every single day, if y'all could, I would love for you to go down to the comment section and let me know what kind of video you would like to see. Let me know if y'all want to be seeing draft targets, if you want more strategy videos, or anything in between. Let me hear it in the comment section. But that's it. Let's get into this video and let's talk about some general fantasy baseball strategy. And let's talk about what we are wanting to do in the early rounds of fantasy baseball drafts. More specifically, are we going to be wanting to go with hitters? Are you going to be wanting to go with pitchers? And I know there is a ton of debate with this conversation. I understand that just with a few people I've talked about, I mean, the answer isn't solidified, but I think we can take a step back. We can go, you know what? Everything we know about pitcher injury rates, everything we know about pitchers being a little bit riskier at the beginning of the drafts, makes us want to go with the hitters that are safe projections, the hitters that are most likely going to be able to stay healthy compared to the pitchers in the same range. And if you can load up on those hitters early in a roto league, in a category league, in a 5x5, whatever you want to call it, if you are playing in a category league, what I'm going to be wanting to do is I'm going to be wanting to go with hitters early. Now, obviously, if you have a DeGrom fall to you at the very end of the first, the beginning of the second, yes, by all means, feel free to take that ace starting pitcher if it becomes a value. But what I do not want to see is I do not want to see us going out there and just straight up reaching on a pitcher because we feel the need to go and get those innings pitched, to get those strikeouts, yada, 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 unless it's a points league. Because in a points league, with the amount of points that those stud starting pitchers like a DeGrom are going to be able to provide for you, I think that's a spot where we can make a pivot. We can go, you know what, I understand they have a higher rate of injury. I understand they are riskier assets. But with how points leagues operate, where you are getting so many points for those pitchers that are going to come out and give you a strikeout an inning, I think that we have to go, you know what, that's the league that we're fine with going with a player like Trevor Bauer at the beginning of the second, the end of the first. If the value is going to represent itself, I think that in those points leagues, we can go with that stud ace pitcher. Okay, now a small thing on what we are going to be wanting to do later in the drafts. Later in the drafts, here it's all about upside. I'll say a couple things. One, generally, I'm going to be wanting to go with the players that are going to be younger, that have not necessarily had a very long track record in Major League Baseball. Maybe they're coming up through the minors. Maybe we have a small sample on them, but we go, you know what? if they hit their 90th percentile outcome, if they are best case scenario, this player can be a league winner. Because regardless of the fantasy sport we are talking about, my number one pet peeve is actually people going in the late rounds just with safety. Because if you're just going to be going with safety in the later rounds, you are really not doing yourself any favors. Just because, say your last 5 picks in a fantasy baseball draft, you understand that you are most likely going to be cutting those guys at some point. You know that those guys are not going to make it through the entire season on your roster. So do you want 5 guys that are all going to be about the same, that don't necessarily have it in their range of outcomes to be league winners, but they're definitely going to provide you a decent amount of production in a few categories? Or do you want to go out there and go, you know what, I'm going to take 5 guys. 4 of them can be horrible. 4 of them can be some of the worst players in baseball where they're not even getting an opportunity. And then I'll know to go out there and drop them right away. And I'll have 1 player left over that hit big time for me, that is now an instant impact player in my lineup, someone that I can start on a night in, night out basis, and could potentially be the difference in me taking down the title. Personally, I'm going to be wanting to go with the riskier guys very late, because you're going to have to drop them anyway. So if they don't hit their ultimate upside, might as well just drop them, because that's what was going to happen when you went to waivers to begin with. Another quick side note is, I'll say also in those later rounds, that's where we are going to be waiting to draft closers. This is something that I learned from Michael, someone a lot smarter than myself in fantasy baseball, and that closers are going to be very hard to project, very hard to predict who is actually going to be getting the saves at this point of the offseason. Now, obviously, as we get more data points going into it, we're going to have better projections where we can go through and go, you know what? Closer X is most likely going to finish out as the closer for the Texas Rangers. And in that case, then you would see that ADP slowly increase. But at this point, mainly even in your fantasy baseball drafts, I would just prefer to wait a little bit on closers, very similar to what we were talking about with the end of the draft anyway. Take more closers than you feel like you need, and then just cut the ones that aren't making an impact, and the few closers that you're left with will be the players that you can roll out there and expect production. All right, now our last thing I'm going to talk about is specifically for 2021, because the 2020 fantasy season was absurd. Obviously, it's going to be very hard to take anything away from it. With the shortened sample size, we know that in baseball, sample size is everything. I mean, you are getting so many plate appearances that you can look at a player throughout the course of the entire season and go, you know what, we have a decent idea on who, just say, player X is. We understand who Christian Yelich is. But when you have the very shortened season, when you don't have all those plate appearances like we saw in 2020, then it's almost impossible. Just because if you run cold, maybe the slump that you were going to have throughout the course of the entire season only happens in that small sample in 2020, and then the entire season numbers look skewed just because you did not have the chance to balance them out. And on the exact opposite end, maybe you were on fire for a stretch in 2020. Maybe there was about a 6-week stretch where you were batting close to 400, where you were one of the best players in baseball, but we understand that if we would have seen a larger sample, you definitely would have cooled off, you definitely would have came back to earth and not looked anything close to what you did during that hot stretch. Then the season-long numbers are going to look wacky. The season-long numbers are going to be very funny in comparison to what they would have been if we had an entire season. So I'm going to say ignore 2020 stats. Not completely ignore, obviously. We're going to have to take some data points. You're going to have to try to put some context behind it with how the players are trending, with how we are looking and viewing lineups coming into the year. But ultimately, I think what's going to be a lot more valuable, especially for beginning fantasy baseball players, is instead of looking at 2020 stats and trying to make your draft picks based on that, go and just look up on Google. Look up 2021 fantasy baseball projections, and you will find multiple websites that provide free projections for these players. And while they may not necessarily be the best tools to use because they are free, I think they are definitely going to be significantly better than if you would just be looking at the 2020 stats overall. All right, now thank you guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. I really hope y'all got something from it. As always, if y'all did, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It really, really helps us out. And yeah, that's it. I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow.